Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. This is exciting to see familiar faces and new faces. So, welcome. This is the first of our public talk or guest lecture series for this semester. And we're very happy to see the turnout, both online and in person. We're sorry for the delay. We're having a little bit of technical problems, so please be patient with us. Meanwhile, I will invite you to, if you're interested, there are courses online that will be starting very soon. There's the chapter 9 of the Bodhicharyavatara from March 3rd to April 18th. Those are Mondays and Fridays, 1:30 to 3 on campus and online. So if you're interested, that would be really great. There is also some other public talks coming next week. On Wednesday will be a talk on Tibetan medicine and how it is relevant for our time. So wonderful from an Amchila. And so please, if you're interested, you're welcome to come. Those are free. At the end of February, February 22nd and 23rd, this is addressing for students. There will be a movement workshop on the weekend as to try to see how the study of texts can be explored in a physical kind of manner. So this will be given by a Japanese teacher who worked with Buto dance, very interesting Japanese dance. If you want to know more, there's registration that is necessary for that. Meanwhile, are we getting closer? Yeah, good. I will introduce our speaker. Many of you know him already. I'm delighted that he accepted to do this talk. We've been talking about this for years. A necessity to talk about this subject. And it seems that it's even more relevant nowadays with all that is happening in the world. So I'm really happy. Dr. McNamara is one of our faculty here, core faculty, very important to the research at our institute. He's a very interesting guy because he's like a walking library, I think. He knows a lot. He's read so much. It's wonderful to be talking with him. So if ever you have a chance to have a chat, that's really good. But also he's studied with many of the most prominent scholars in Buddhist studies to this day. So that's also a very rich area into from which we are benefiting here at Rangjung Yeshe Institute. And so now I think now we're getting there. So please welcome with me our dear friend, Professor McNamara.
Thank you so much, Dion. That's really too kind. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So before we get started, there really is just simply too much to say about Buddhism and Islam, even within this relatively restricted period, only 5 centuries, right? And so my hope is that if there's sufficient interest in the future, we can have some kind of more targeted discussion of things like Sufism and Tantric yoga and so forth. If there's time, that would be wonderful today, but I'm just going to be honest with myself. There's not going to be time today. So apologies if that's disappointing. I hope so. I do hope so. I would also note, as Dion kindly said, I am a scholar of Buddhist studies. I am not a scholar of Islamic studies. And primarily my endpoint into Islam is historical, and specifically these interactions that take place relatively early on in Islam, specifically in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, when there was much more goodwill than is often said. Okay. Let's see. We okay? No. Eesh. What's so? I guess I could do like improv dance for my slides. It's good. Okay. Okay. Can we go to the second slide, please? Thanks. Okay, so methodologically here, we're dealing with some very broad strokes and a couple of highlights. The highlights are subjective, but I'm fairly confident that you'll agree that they're interesting. So the broad strokes primarily deal with the early history and development of Islam and its expansion, which, as we'll see, is very directly relevant to the kinds of conversations that Buddhists and Muslims were having with each other, right? Okay, next slide, please. So if you see here, this is the Silk Road much earlier than the period we're primarily interested in. But even at this time, this incorporates the formation of the Roman Empire. For example, there is a very vast network linking particularly the Middle East and Central Asia down into India and over into China, right? Now, it's a sad fact that largely because of the way university departments are set up, in my opinion, there simply isn't that much acknowledgement of the fact that India is very close to the Middle East. There's a big departmental line that normally gets drawn in religion departments between Islam and South Asian religions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, which is, in my opinion, quite silly, especially given just how many millions of Muslims there are in India, for example, right? So that line is artificial, right? It's not here. And in keeping with that, we have to acknowledge that the people who live in these spaces, particularly caravans, merchants of various kinds, were absolutely talking to each other and spreading ideas before, during, and after the kind of imperial heyday of early Islam. So this also gives us a chance to reflect on the primary mode and reason for which Buddhists and Muslims were talking to each other. In brief, both of these religions, these cultural systems, we should say, are extremely economically based. Now, those of you who've already taken kind of the 101 and 102 courses here probably are familiar with this, but it may sound a little strange to some of us. But Buddhism was absolutely a trading religion, and merchants were the biggest patrons. Monks and nuns were often patrons themselves, so stupas and so forth, right? And so what really enabled these people to talk to each other, the common ground, is the common ground of commerce, of trade. So specifically, Muslims were able to accommodate Buddhists within their cultural thinking. And Buddhists, unlike Hindus, were not restricted by issues of caste. When a new type of person came into India and tried to interact with Hindu communities, there's always this question of how do we fit these people in who don't have a caste? How does this make sense? Likewise, the purity and impurity of Brahmanism, during this time period. When I say this time period, I mean, again, 700s until 1000s, maybe 1200s at the very latest, right? So at first, it was simply easy for these communities to interact with each other. They were willing to do it. They were interested in trade, interested in commerce, interested in living peacefully alongside each other, which they did. narratives of Islam to the contrary. Eventually, Hindu communities did adapt, and Buddhism, did kind of lessen in influence, particularly toward the end of this time period, around the 1200s. I say that delicately, partly because in this talk, one thing we really have to do is battle a couple of wide-held narratives and assumptions, right? Such as the assumption that Muslims just swept into India and destroyed everything in their path and replaced it with their own culture. That doesn't even sound like it could make sense, right? It's also simply not true. It's documented that Buddhists remained in India, maybe in lesser numbers, but until at least the 1400s. I'm trying to be careful here. And while, of course, we have to be honest with ourselves and say that, yes, armies that were composed primarily of Muslims did do things like burn Nalanda. Of course, that happened. We're not pretending. But this narrative, Muslims did this. For one, it's false because Islam is not one thing. It's Turkic people. And not all of them were Muslim. Right? I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I really have too many points to cover. So I want to just make sure I get the important things kind of down. So I'll let this be an introduction to what I intend to inform against, and maybe we can discuss whether or not you agree with me, right? Karsa. Okay, let me stop there, and I'll get back to that. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay. Thank you to my wife, Nadia, for designing these wonderful slides that are much more entertaining and beneficial than I could have done. I don't assume any knowledge of Islam amongst folks here. Is that fair? Is that okay? Okay, so the word means submission or engaged surrender. It's possibly also related to the Semitic Arabic root SLM, which gives us shalom, as well as salam, as in the common greeting, assalamu alaikum, right? So Islam is a deen. It's not exactly a dharma, but it is a way of life and a code of conduct. So it's bigger than religion, the way we use this word today, right? That's very important. I would also note that the well-known word Allah is not the name of the Islamic deity. It is the Arabic word that means the, God. It's the God, right? And that is used by Arabic-speaking Christians and Jews, which do exist, right? Okay, next slide, please. Great. So the Prophet Muhammad was orphaned at a very young age and brought up by his uncle, Abu Talib, who was the head of their clan. Their family administered the black, the black cube that I think everyone here would recognize, known as the Kaaba, right, in Mecca. He married the Prophet in his early 20s, as he was getting involved in trading, especially perfume trading. Say more about that in a second. He married his boss, who was about 20 years older than him and who was a widow and who was a successful businesswoman in her own right. And she was a very strong influence in the Prophet's life. So when he was around 40 years old, the Prophet started going up to a particular cave and meditating. We don't know exactly what meditate means here. Probably not shamatha, right? But from what I've been able to gather, it seems that he was contemplating the fact of nature, the fact of existence, the plurality of flora and fauna, and so forth, in theistic terms as kind of God's creation. This is my own speculation. And at some point, he had a vision. And the story of the prophet's revelations really highlight the fact that it isn't him speaking. According to some accounts, the prophet was illiterate. At any rate, the idea is he could not have produced something as beautiful as the Quran on his own. And his revelations sound, at least to me, a lot like seizures. He would kind of shake and go unconscious, and something would happen to him, and it would kind of come out of him, right? So very different than, for example, like a gongter or something like that, right? And a mind terma in the Himalayan traditions. And in his first revelation, the archangel Gabriel commands him, recite, read, do it, and declares that he is the latest in a line of prophets who include Jesus, right? Jesus is not the Messiah, of course, in Islam, but he is a prophet, with Muhammad being the kind of culmination of all past prophets. Karsa. Yes, this note here, the link to Abraham through Ishmael, Gabriel also told the prophet that they do have historically Judaic roots, that the Arab people are descended from, are linked to Abraham through Ishmael. Okay. So, as I understand it, the prophet comes down, understandably freaked out, and confides in his wife. And it's really his wife, Khadija, who convinces him that this is something, that this is real, and that he should start speaking to people and not be afraid of what's happening. So the first two converts to Islam are Khadija and the prophet's cousin, who is Abu Talib's son, named Ali, who's important for our story. So the prophet taught for approximately 22 years in Medina, then in Mecca, then died peacefully. Some of these slides may overlap, hopefully not. Can you go to the next one? Right, so stories about the birth of the prophets do include a lot of miracles, and the notion that from the very beginning he was destined for this kind of great thing. We shouldn't obviously put strong historical stock in that, but we shouldn't dismiss it either, because even if we can't link it to what we would call hard history, it's part of how Muslims have understood themselves and how Muslims understand themselves now, right? So this is just a historical methodology note for you. We don't want to say, oh, well, they were right about this, wrong about that, and try to just see the world of the communities that we're examining, right, on its own terms, on their terms. In any case, there's some examples of some of the miraculous things here. Apparently, his mother became so brilliant when she was pregnant with him that that she would literally light up a room in the dark, for example. He was considered trustworthy and judicious as a young man. No real surprise there. Next slide, please. Thanks so much. Okay. Yes, this is a little bit of a repetition. Sorry about that, but this is a little more detail. So that's nice. Okay, but I've already said everything I have to say about this. The next one, please. Okay, so the formation of Islam was difficult and long, and by and large, the Arabic community was, especially in Mecca, was quite resistant to it. So resistant that eventually, I'll get to this in a moment, Muhammad had to flee for his own safety to Medina, right, in what's called al-Hijra. But just before that, he did have a particularly profound experience either in a vision or potentially, according to some sources, he miraculously went to these places, to Jerusalem, and then upward and to a direct encounter with God, who's not personified here, and goes to heaven and goes to hell and meets previous prophets, which links this story in a sense to Delp traditions, which are very similar, and likewise to Dante's Divine Comedy, right, such as the Inferno and so forth. These narratives that we see kind of, maybe it's all a coincidence, but I think that there is a lot of give and take. This is one example of people sharing ideas and kind of adapting them to their own cultures, right? I mean that not so much with the prophet and more in terms of later literature, such as Dante's Divine Comedy. Okay, next, please. Right. So in 622, which is year one of the Hijra calendar, as I said, he has to flee Mecca for his own safety. He goes and he's taken in not by the Arabic community exactly, but by the Jewish community. He's given shelter by the Jewish community in Medina. And in Medina, he's able to really get people kind of on board with his mission. And so when he comes back to Mecca after some time, he comes back with, well, literally an army, but also figuratively speaking, an army. And that kind of solidifies the places of Mecca and Medina as the kind of birthplaces of Islam. Yeah. Okay. So this flight is, well, we can see that it's important, if nothing else, because you don't make something year one in your calendar for nothing, right? But it is really a juncture in terms of how the prophet thought about what he was doing and the creation of the Umma, the community of believers. There is just some educational aspects here. Again, I don't assume any knowledge of Islam, so please permit me. Quranic revelations faced what I think, things that the Buddha faced as well, that the Buddha's stories are told, sayings attributed to the Buddha face the same sort of things. Well, aren't you contradicting yourself, right? So Mahayana Buddhism forms the three wheels, where the Buddha says something slightly different in each, depending on what people need to hear, of course. In this case, it matters when a revelation happened, and it matters when one of the prophet's actions happened, with later revelations really superseding earlier ones. As the community formed, then more and more of these revelations had to do with kind of what the community is supposed to do and how it can be organized, right? Okay, here, perhaps in the questions we can talk more about jihad, but I would note that, of course, today, jihad is absolutely, manifest as a violent struggle. It is supposed to be defensive. And again, as a side note, so much as there is logic to violence, the underlying logic of the violence of jihad is that Islam is sort of intrinsically under attack by other forces. And so it's intrinsically defensive. I don't agree with that. I doubt that you do either. But again, I'm just trying to educate a little bit here. But jihad also could be understood similar to, Shantideva. Shantideva telling himself that he has to stand at the cave of his own mind with a spear, right? I'm sure some of you know that verse better than I do, but there is, it's not apologetics. It's very true. This notion of jihad as internal cultivation, as patience, and as a struggle against your own, your own negative feelings toward others, and whatever keeps the world from having, from being the peaceful place that it's supposed to be in the Islamic vision, can be considered jihad. Okay. There's a couple historical details here. that I don't need to get into. Okay, so next. Great. The Prophet died 10 years after the Hijrah. And it's debated whether he was poisoned and died from that. It's not debated that he was poisoned. He was. If he didn't die from it, he may have died as an after effect from it. He was not a young man at this time, but he was 62. So for me personally, it's believable that that did cause some kind of complication. And immediately after his death, there was drama. Basically, the community was relatively split between people who thought that the Prophet's cousin and family member and very close confidant, cousin brother, kind of, Ali, should lead, should be the caliph, the caliph. Caliph means the successor, specifically the successor to the Prophet. But Ali was only in his early 30s at that time, and many people thought that he was simply not grown up enough to lead the community. And so a more successful movement for leadership was made by the Prophet's close friend Abu Bakr, who became the first caliph. Right? Ali did eventually become the fourth caliph, but we'll talk about that in just a second. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I really need to highlight here that we can't transplant categories such as Sunni and Shia. We can't transplant later categories onto these events as they were unfolding, right? Karsa. And so we can talk in terms of Sunni and Shia, but we have to understand that those groups didn't use those terms. They didn't identify themselves in that way until at the earliest, the 900s. And there were a lot of groups, many. There was quite a lot of division in early Islam, especially. And well, it hasn't stopped, really, to be perfectly honest. But if we're going to use these terms, then the Sunnis are people who follow the example, the sunnah of the Prophet, who do what the Prophet did. This is kind of like, in the U.S., the political parties, Republicans and Democrats. Are we pro-democracy? Are we pro-republic? Everyone is pro following the example. It's really just a name. And Sufism is the mystical dimension of Sunni Islam. Shiism has its own forms of mysticism that may or may not fall under the category of Sufi. And presently, or at least last time I looked at this, these are several years old, approximately 80% of Muslims are Sunni. Shia take their name from the followers, Shi'atu, of Ali, the Prophet's cousin. There are two important subgroups of Shia. Normally, when we use that word, we're talking about a group called the Ash'ari or Twelver Shias. And the other main group is Ismaili Shias. Unfortunately, just 2 or 3 days ago, the leader of Ismaili Shiism, the Aga Khan, passed away. Karsa. So getting back to our main topic for just a second, certainly Sunni Muslims have quite a lot of role in in interactions with India, with Indic people, with Buddhists, and so forth. But culturally speaking, the stories that we're talking about here have much more to do with Ash'ari Shias and especially with Ismailis. It's really, those are groups, Ismaili Shias especially, were often considered themselves persecuted. They were certainly a minority. Whether that played a direct role in their interactions with Buddhists or not, I don't know. Maybe we can talk about that another time. But it does seem like, for example, if you're familiar, when the Kalachakra Tantra talks about Muslims, which it does, and it doesn't have particularly nice things to say about them, it looks like they're talking about specifically Ismailis. Okay, so just organizing that for us. All right, so the main early distinguishing issue here is the succession of the prophet, as I said. And more generally, we can say that Sunni communities do not require a person to have a genetic link to the Prophet Muhammad in order to be leaders. Shias do consider that. It is kind of hereditary in some sense. At least it's supposed to be, in theory. Okay, next, please. So, while all of this division and infighting was going on, while people were kind of arguing about not only who should lead the community, but how should the community kind of go on after the prophet, while that was happening, what became the first caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate, expanded, and then a later second caliphate called the Abbasids, I'll say more about those later, expanded with a speed and scope that has rarely been seen on this earth. The best kind of parallel I can make here is the speed with which the Mongols under so-called Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan were able to just expand and create this enormous empire. Right. So as if we look at this map, we can see that by 750, all of the territory from Spain over to Kabul was controlled in some way by, under the aegis of the Caliphate, right? And so during that time, Muslims had to interact with quite a lot of new people, different kinds of people. Many of them were Jews and Christians. And there was a way for Muslims to kind of deal with that. They could put those people in a box. As you may be familiar, even in the Prophet's time, Abrahamic traditions were considered to be what's called in Arabic al-bayt, the people of the book, right? Now, I point that out because what's less known is that, oh, thank you. What's less well known is that for at least a few centuries, Buddhists were also people of the book and were able to live peacefully under Muslim rule, treated exactly the way that Jewish and Christian people were, which is to say, so long as they didn't revolt, so long as they didn't try to overthrow the Muslims in power, and so long as they paid the jizya, the tax, then they were left alone. And so it's not the case exactly that there's something special about the Abrahamic traditions, in my opinion. What set Buddhism apart, what made them kind of okay to be categorized as people of the book, is that they weren't obviously idolaters. They weren't interested in transactional religion. So I submit to you that the distinction that Muslims make in terms of kind of people who are okay and people who aren't under political Islamic rule isn't about whether you follow the Abrahamic deity. It's whether you can see something larger than your own family, your own life, your own community. It's having this kind of macro view of the world that really sets those people apart. Right. Okay. Thank you. Right. So as this expanded, I really need to make this point very clearly. Muslims didn't force everyone to become Muslim. Muslims certainly didn't kill everyone who wasn't Muslim. There are times and places where those things happened, but the movement was simply too small. And in this early period, Muslims were not interested in other people becoming Muslim. Why not? Well, believe it or not, it's economics. As these military forces expand, all Muslim families, regardless of whether they fought or not, were entitled to some of the share of the spoils of war. So they were paid. And the families, as time goes on, the families of the people who converted earlier got a bigger share than families who converted later. Why am I mentioning all this? Well, because, as I said, there was a vested interest for many Arabic Muslims for people not to be Muslim. It was easier that way. After some time, after maybe 700s approximately, I don't have that number in my head or at my fingertips, non-Arabs could become Muslim, but they really were given a second place status. They were called clients, or Malawi in Arabic, and were really second class citizens. So this understandably created some tension, in particular as the empire expanded, as particularly Persians wanted to become Muslim and became Muslims. They weren't happy being treated this way by Arabics, by Arab peoples who, at least in stereotypical broad strokes, Persian culture was very sophisticated and kind of felt itself in some way superior to Arabs. This, at least, is how the story is told. So this led eventually in 750 CE to a revolt that begins kind of where our story continues from, which is in Afghanistan and in Central Asia more generally. I note here, so this revolt is credited, it's said that happened in 750. The revolt didn't stop the Muslim expansion. Excuse me. And in 751, a year later, the Abbasid Arab, primarily Arab army, the Tibetan army of what was then the Yarling dynasty, and the Tang Empire all clashed. They all butted heads. This is usually told, this story, in terms of just the Abbasids and the Tang, but the Tibetans fought actually on both sides. And during this time, they controlled a lot of the territory that these folks were fighting over. Now, why were these folks fighting over some areas of land in Central Asia? Well, as we saw earlier, the Silk Road, right? It was absolutely economically vital for each of these cultures to have control over this territory, right? So that they could impose taxes on trade routes and so forth. Okay, next, please. Okay, so now that we have about 15 minutes left, I can get to the bulk of my talk. It's 1 hour, right? Alessa? Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'll try not to go over too much. So those were the broad strokes. Here are some highlights. And the highlights have to do with a city in Afghanistan called Balkh, a group called the Barmakids, and the interaction between Sanskrit, Buddhist cultures, and broadly Islamicate cultures. Okay, I should note when I use the word Islamicate, I'm following a very venerable scholar of Islam named Marshall Hodson, who wanted to distinguish between Islam, the religion, certainly Islamism, which is a kind of militant type of Islam, and the cultural systems that the different Islamic communities developed. So Islamicate refers to the culture, right? Okay, so there was a family. The id in Barmakid is linked to the Greek ides. It's a patronymic. So the Barmakids are the people who are descended from Barmak. We don't know much about Barmak. It's said that his brother was the abbot of a very important monastic complex in Balkh in Afghanistan. They converted to Islam at some point for reasons unknown, and very quickly became central to the Abbasids especially. I should note, the Abbasid revolution did not destroy the Umayyad Empire. Rather, it took a lot of its territory, specifically the eastern part of the caliphate, right? So Central Asia, Middle East, their capital, they created the city of Baghdad. Hopefully I can say something about that in a second. But the Umayyads remained, but maintained territory in Spain, in North Africa, and so forth. So what we have here is two different caliphates, two different empires, and two different kind of cultural systems and cultural orientations. One of the reasons Central Asians, particularly Persians, wanted to have this revolution and supported the Abbasids is because they had hope that they wouldn't be treated as second-class Muslims anymore, second-class citizens. That didn't really work out as well as they wanted it to. Yeah, no problem. In any case, so my point there, the reason I got there from here is it really was Central Asian sentiment that allowed this revolution to take place. Okay, so in the early decades of this empire, the Abbasid Empire, including the reign of someone you may have heard of, Harun al-Rashid, famous from the Arabian Nights and so forth. The most important family in terms of education were the Barmakids, these recent Buddhist turned Muslim converts who have strong associations with specifically a huge Buddhist monastic college, not just a monastery, a monastic college, similar to Nalanda and Vikramasila in Balkh in Afghanistan. So the grandson of the eponymous Barmak, a guy named Yahya ibn Khalid al-Barmak, is the tutor of Harun al-Rashid, later becomes his vizier, his advisor. And he used that to promote Sanskrit, Indian, Buddhist learning and culture far more than, for example, Greek learning and culture. Now, we're dealing here with a fairly small period of time, but a very important period of time. It was a few decades, but a lot can happen in a few decades. And so during this time, for example, Indian architects were sent to design a place called the City of Peace, which is Baghdad. That is not in dispute. And the City of Peace can be translated from Sanskrit, Bhagadatta, gift of God, gift of enjoyment, or gift of the enjoyer, something like that, right? And so while primarily what Yahya ibn Khalid al-Barmak was promoting was practical knowledge, such as pharmaceutical information, Indic texts on medicine, on plants, works on mathematics and astronomy. Other things, and specifically Buddhist things, did also come in. It seems like the Barmakids didn't forget their family heritage, regardless of what their relationship individually was with Buddhism at the time. Okay, now, unfortunately, the family fell into disgrace in the year 803. We won't get into the reasons for that. They're a little complicated. And so Yahya went from being really the preeminent academic scholar of his day to dying in prison. And so, as I write here, some argue that the Barmakids retained their Buddhist leanings. I just can't say anything about that either way. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get back to this general notion. People trading with each other, people, particularly after 750, as we see, Muslim, people who were Muslim were coming into contact with what had been up to that point primarily Buddhist communities. And those Buddhist communities, as I said, continued to persist, if not always thrive, for centuries under Muslim rule. This happened in Afghanistan until at least 1000 CE, for example, right? During that time, of course, people talk to each other because that's what people do. So some really obvious points there are popular stories spread. I'll say more about that in a minute. A lot of forms of knowledge made their way not just from Buddhist communities and Sanskrit language materials into Persian and Arabic, but then made their way into Europe after that. And so we see not a direct link from the Arthashastra, the Indic manual on life, turning into Machiavelli's The Prince, but there was a clear directionality and a clear influence. Right. So these are not cases where people happen to think of the same thing at different time or at different places around the same time. Right. Likewise, chess, the game of chess, was imported from India and became chaz in Arabic and in Persian, and then eventually made its way into Europe. As I mentioned, architecture, certainly there's a lot of influence. We'll get back to this. This is important. So what did people think it was important to talk about? Well, interesting stories, especially morality tales, stories that were in some way useful or created knowledge or cultivation, developed humans. Astrology, definitely. As I said, medicine and so forth. So, for example, a Central Asian person, a person born in the area of Afghanistan, of Balkan Afghanistan, named Al-Khwarizmi, adopts the Indian concept of zero and goes on to invent algebra and algorithms. Let's see. I would also note that chemistry comes from alchemy. It's al, right? Like Allah. It's not an accident. It shows the Arabic origins of these words. Yeah, chemistry comes from alchemy. That's a separate story. Okay, next slide, please. So, as I said, the Barmakids oversaw an intense effort at translating Sanskrit texts into Arabic and Persian. Now, it's not that under the Caliphate there was no Greek learning, but for these decades, it seems the intelligentsia, the intellectuals, were looking east, not west. And the fall of the Barmakid family seems to have been so great that, after 803, everything turned westward. And that's when you really see the emphasis on Aristotle, for example, and on Greek mathematics and so forth. So, I'd like to play, in this case, a game of, what would have happened if things had gone a little bit different for this family. I'm not overstating my point when I say if things had gone a little different for this family, the world might look very different than it does today. Okay, so some examples of the stories that I think are useful to bring up. Jatakas, particularly the Buddha's lives as animals, and also a larger Indic body of animal folk tales called the Panchatantra, are adopted into an Arabic text called the Kalila Wadimna, which is one of the influences for Aesop's fables. Right. I'm talking here, of course, primarily about Buddhism and Islam, but I'm trying to bring up how these things filter into Europe as well. Most importantly, for our purposes, primarily the Buddha Charta, but the Buddha's life story, period, was definitely rendered into Persian and Arabic sometime before 800 CE. And the main character, the Bodhisattva, shows up as a character named Buddhasaph in Persian, who becomes Yudasaph in Arabic, who becomes Ioasaph in Greek, and eventually Jehoshaphat. So if you're, a native English speaker, you might have heard somebody say jumping Jehoshaphat in the past. That's actually the Buddha. And again, this is not speculation. This is all very well documented. It makes sense linguistically. The reason we know these things is because I should note there was a very prominent upscale bookseller in Baghdad in the early 800s named Al-Nadim, and he left a very detailed catalog. And so we know, at least as of 800, how many Sanskrit texts and what they were. And that's really where our data comes from. Like, okay, what did they translate? What was important to them, right? That's the main kind of source of all of that evidence. Okay, next slide, please. Right. All right. Now we're going to pivot here for a second. And hopefully this makes sense. This is a story that may sound a little strange. We can talk about the details if you like. This is an argument that I'm making following scholars, and I'll show you my sources and things, but it's a very different idea than we normally have. At the beginning of the talk, I had said there are some assumptions that we have to get over, right? The first and most important being that Islam is a single element which destroys everything in its path and has no, has no use for anyone who doesn't convert. That's just simply false. It is a narrative that helps out a lot of people, though, and the idea, particularly of Buddhism being the kind of good other for Europe and Islam being the bad other for Europe, is extremely old. I'm saying this because another point that we need to understand is that not only have many of us failed to appreciate how much Buddhist culture influenced Islamic culture, but how much Islamic culture influenced Europe. There are a lot of people who want to say, well, for example, madrassas are uniquely Islamic ways of learning, and that universities are uniquely European ways of learning. This has a lot more to do with prejudice than it has to do with anything else, frankly. Okay, so bear with me here. The first college in Europe is a college called the Collège de 18, the College of 18. 18 or 80, sorry. Okay, thank you. Brain fart. In Paris in 1180 by a guy named Josias of London. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. After he traveled to, quote, Jerusalem, after he traveled to the Middle East. So a guy goes around the Middle East, sees a bunch of madrasas, and perhaps completely coincidentally decides to do basically the same thing in Paris, right? The madrasas are much earlier. The first madrasa was built in the early 900s in a place called Bust, which is close to Bok, close to this place of, learning from where the Barmakids came and where there was, again, this giant Buddhist monastic university. So there's that. And then there's this kind of complicated system of argumentation that, frankly, I don't really want to get into the details, but I can tell you about it later, called the recursive argument, which, according to Christopher Beckwith, who's the scholar I mainly rely on here, is based in the Mahavibhasha, which was thriving in Afghanistan and was the curriculum and set the curriculum of the Navbahar at Balkh. So there's a specific argument, specific kinds and ways of learning showing up where there were Buddhists, then there become madrasas, and then similar kinds of things start showing up in Europe, but later. But after, in this case, one person went to the Middle East. Okay, maybe that's a coincidence. Granted. Got it. Okay. So I would note here also that there's a very specific influence of Sarvastivada learning. Here I'm using Sarvastivada and Mahavibhasha as basically overlapping, but Sarvastivada is a larger term than the Mahavibhasha. It's also a monastic lineage, where the Mahavibhasha is a book. So this argument, specifically based on the Mahavibhasha, also gets used in madrasas, but also ends up getting used in European colleges and universities. The difference is that where Islamic cultures mainly were interested in arguing in terms of theology, at least from what we know, Europeans started applying these things to the natural sciences, to biology, also to mathematics, and so forth. So here, in brief, what is a recursive argument? The recursive argument is the system we see, for example, in the in Vasubandhu's Abhidharmakosha, of a primary argument and then sub-arguments, as opposed to, if you're familiar with Plato, the character of Socrates, he went around and sort of asked people questions and kind of saw where it went. So in some ways, this is more systematic. The word recursive is used because the basic terms of the argument, the basic overall argument, keeps showing up. It's kind of the umbrella under which the other things play out, whereas the question and answer dialogical method can kind of go in various kinds of directions. Okay. So here I note there's a type of Islamic philosophy called the Mu'tazila, who are atomists, who weren't just atomists and who weren't just thriving in, you guessed it, Afghanistan around that same time, but who were using exactly the same kinds of atomic theories that Sarvastivadins use and the same examples. They use the same examples, such as a mountain and a mustard seed. Okay, maybe that's a coincidence. It's true. It's true, right? Okay. Madrasas spread from the area of Afghanistan and Central Asia to the West, and their influence on the formation of universities and colleges is very, very well documented. So what do we have here? We have the importation of alchemy becoming chemistry, of algebra, algorithms, the importation of the Buddha's life, and this kind of historical point of the focus on eastward-looking Sanskritic knowledge up until a very specific point in history, followed by a dramatic about-face and a focus on Greek learning. I would note, because we're also talking about Europe, that while it is true that there was at least one translation in Europe from Greek into Latin of Aristotle's works around 1150, it was not popular, so far as we can see. People weren't citing it. About 75 years later, it was retranslated using both Greek and Arabic recensions with Arabic commentaries. Not Arabic translations, Arabic-speaking people's commentaries. And that's when it entered the kind of bloodstream of European academics. And it's skyrocketed. And things like natural science and Aristotle, these are not small things in the evolution of the European college in the early centuries after 1000, right? Okay. Next slide, please. All right. Right. So here I quote a scholar. I basically made this point already about the notion that this recursive argument, this specific scholarly method that helped pave the foundations for what later became the scientific method as we know it, showed up in Central Asia in places that had been predominantly Buddhist, where Buddhism still maintained influence, and again made its way westward. Geez, it's like I keep saying the same thing over and over, but with different examples. It's almost like this entire system of learning as a package made its way through the Islamic world into Europe, right? So here I just have some notes. Early universities were more like guilds. We can talk about that if you like. Basically meaning it wasn't so much the rigid structure we have here of professor and student, but rather everyone was a member, and there were qualifications for what qualified you as a master of a particular subject. But it functioned more like a trade guild than like a university as we understand it today. Okay. Here I note there are architectural similarities. Madrasas definitely borrowed from Vihār structures, and universities and colleges, after a certain point, borrowed from madrasas. Right. So, in brief, madrasas borrowed both architecture and educational system from Vihāras. Colleges and universities started to evolve, becoming recognizable at exactly the same time that Arabic translations of Aristotle, madrasa-style argumentation methods, and madrasa architecture entered into Europe. But it could be a coincidence, for sure. Okay. So why isn't that better known? Well, I submit that it's not better known because there is this tendency in European history to kind of delete all of the uncomfortable ways in which it is deeply indebted to Arabic and Persian language, culture, and knowledge. There's likewise a tendency in Islamic culture to want things to not be innovations. It's a dirty word in Islam, and not want things to come from external systems, particularly other religions, right? Okay, so here, the scholar Christopher Beckwith that I've been mentioning that I really rely on a lot here. So another reason, and I have to grant this is a tough one. There was a gap of about 90 years between the solid formation of madrassas and the thriving of the Navbahar at Balkh, this monastic university. But as Christopher Beckwith tells us, sorry, this is a long quotation, roughly summarizing the position that the madrasa is a uniquely Muslim system necessitates supposing, now I'm reading here, that when the Central Asian Buddhists converted to Islam, they forgot the functions of the buildings they were using. They forgot how to argue in their traditional, highly distinctive manner. They forgot everything else they were doing according to Buddhist traditions. And then, as Muslims, they or their descendants very creatively invented new architectural forms, endowments, and educational functions, and they invented an extremely distinctive way of arguing, which miraculously was absolutely identical to the one used by the same people in exactly the same places. Wow. Man, that's a coincidence. Okay. Next slide, please. So we can talk about some other subjects, but I'm going to end it here, and hopefully we can discuss a bit. But I just wanted to note my most important sources, which I really recommend. Christopher Beckwith has several books, but Warriors of the Cloisters is where he really lays out this argument about universities. Also, I was very pleased to see the Berzin archives. Alexander Berzin, a very notable Gelugpa monk and scholar, has an extraordinary amount of information on the web. He's very, very knowledgeable about Buddhist-Muslim relations historically and today. So certainly look at that if you want more information. And last but not least, this is in alphabetical order, a scholar named Johan Elverskog wrote a book called Buddhism and Islam on the Silk Road. And that title is not deceptive. That it's a very, very good study of all of these things. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
We have about 20 minutes to discuss. So is there any? Yes.
Well, thank you for a very erudite and fascinating overview of the interactions between Buddhism, Islam, and European culture in that time period you're talking about. I've certainly learned some things and have piqued my interest in exploring further. I was surprised to hear that there was a time that Buddhism was considered or Buddhists were considered members of people of the book, right?
Yep.
That's something that was new to me.
Mhm.
And it jars a little bit with my understanding of what the book is,
Right.
in that expression, people of the book, which I understand to be the Old Testament or
Yes.
the, those who, the early portion of what we call the Bible, right? Which is shared with Muslims and Jews. So I'd like to just get some clarification about how that was possible. And then also, just in terms of the doctrinal dimension of that surrounding that expression, there's understanding that those who aren't members of people, who aren't people of the book, are in some sense outside. They haven't submitted, right? And so I appreciated the fact that you pointed out that Islamic culture is not necessarily the same. Like there were plenty of periods of history where we have Islamic culture migrating, and it's not just the invasion picture that we have, right? With the armies and so on that destroyed Nalanda and did so much destruction. You also had ordinary people who were carrying their culture with them too, and so that's an important corrective. And so, just I wonder if you might respond to that general set of considerations as my own mind adjusts to what you said.
Thanks so much, Martin. Well, can I ask, did you have a comment or something to like about the kind of the larger picture that I got your question about the people of the book and the
yeah, no, I just the second part was more an appreciation for the corrective that you've given here. But I guess if there is a kind of comment or question, maybe you could talk more about the side that how we've come to have a kind of caricature of of the picture of the interactions between, for example, Islam and Buddhism and so on.
Yeah, great, thank you. Right, so the people of the book is, yes, indeed, some kind of Abrahamic corpus, absolutely. Why it happened that Buddhists were considered part of, like, included in that group, I can speculate. I did speculate. I think it's because there was a vested interest in doing and having good business dealings and general good relations with that community. And because this is my own personal thought, what I said earlier about, the main contrast as Islam developed, the main contrast that the Prophet was making between the vision of his revelations and other things and non-Islam is really a transactional religion. I want to marry this or that person, and if you help me do that, then I'll do something good. I don't know, which still persists, of course, to this day, but particularly a specific focus on idols, right? And so what I would say to that is that the people who aren't people of the book early on are defined as people who don't have this larger vision. And as far as I understand it, in the Prophet's time and place and in his mind, people who had this larger vision beyond their own time were Jews and Christians. That's what he was exposed to. And I think that the Prophet very clearly was, and very intentionally, and partly through revelation, was creating the sort of thing for Arabs that he had seen in Jewish and Christian communities, right? And so I think it was utilitarian and practical more than anything else, but there is a theoretical justification for it, even if it's a little weird to call them people of the book. And what I would just add is, so I don't know exactly why it happened, but it's not disputed that it happened. Buddhists did live peacefully, as I said, under the rule of Muslims for hundreds of years. And so some kind of peace was made with that. That wouldn't have been possible if there wasn't a basic acceptance of Buddhists. As to why, I want to take at least another question or two. As to why it's not better known, well, as I've said, these narratives, these assumptions are very convenient for a lot of people. And interestingly enough, for example, the narrative of the Islamic sword is very convenient for Muslims as well as for Hindus at certain times in history. So the person who's kind of singularly pointed at, in the narrative of Islam came and destroyed so many things about Buddhism and Indian and other Indian cultural systems. The kind of so-called mastermind of that is a guy named Mahmud of Ghazni, who was the ruler of a Central Asian kingdom called Ghazni. And he embraced himself as being the kind of ideal Ghazi, or holy warrior. And so all of his wars were sort of intrinsically jihad. All of his wars were intrinsically holy wars. Now, the inconvenient truth there is that there was a Hindu quarter in the capital city of Ghazna, and there were definitely Hindu members of Mahmud of Ghazna's army. Why do I say definitely? Because his court poet brags about it. So there's this kind of very uneasy tension here, right? But then, as I said, it's not only Europe that has this very deeply set notion of Buddhists are good and Muslims are bad. And it's just so ingrained that it's hard to get rid of. And it's just an easy story that everybody is willing to accept and won't question, right? And I think that's why these inconvenient truths kind of get slid over.
I have a question that kind of piggybacks off of that, and just a brief cultural contextual point that also piggybacks off of that. So in regards to this idea of people of the book, interestingly, also Buddhism moved from non-pictorial images of the Buddha in around the 6th century, and Islam comes around in the 7th century, but we don't really see a widespread movement of pictorial representations in Buddhism until later. Do you think that that may have impacted why Buddhists lost their status as people of the book? And the brief contextual point is that while people were allowed to live as people of the book, it's very important to remember that the first ethnic cleansing of people of the book took place in 625 of the Banu Nadir and the Banu Quraysh, who were actually the tribes that took Muhammad into Mecca. And this was followed 3 years later by the Battle of Khaybar and the ethnic cleansing there, which followed in 640. So it is really important to remember that while these people of the book were not treated as badly, the earliest ethnic cleansing was only 3 years after his flight to Medina. So I just like to put that in there. I don't want to promote any Islamophobia in this. I just think it's really important when we're discussing the treatment of people of the book.
And likewise, the jizya tax, the tax that people of the book had to pay, it is punitive. It's kind of intentionally punitive. And there's a lot of argument about kind of, was it like, oh, just pay a tax? In some cases, it was no, like a Muslim was supposed to go to, say, a Jewish person's house and be as demanding and as kind of arrogant and as violent as they possibly could in the extraction of that. My answer to that, my incomplete understanding, is that it works different ways in different times and places. So thank you for reminding us that, I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything. There's a lot of violence in this story. It's just that violence is often everything, the only thing anybody ever wants to talk about, right? Along with the violence, there's a lot of knowledge. I'm going to have to look. For that note, by the time the Muslim folks got to, for example, Bamiyan, I believe the Buddhas were already there. But I will say, I think it's worth noting the conversion of the king of Kabul occurred around 813. His name was Rinchen, believe it or not. And at the time, Kabul, Afghanistan, was part of it was politically part of the Tibetan Empire, not culturally so much. But he, as a gesture of his own submission, his becoming Muslim, he donated a very large, either gold or silver, statue of Maitreya, which was melted down and made into coins in Mecca. So I think your point's really interesting about iconic and iconic, but I believe that at least early on, there were not just statues, but kind of very important statues. The Buddhas of Bamiyan are enormous. There's a whole lot to say about those. And at any rate, certainly for at least 100 years, somehow the caliphs, I keep mispronouncing that word, the caliphs, or the Muslim kind of political rule seems to have been okay with the statues. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more elaborated about the picture of Muslim in the Kalachakra Tantra?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Hang on. Oh, good. Can you go down one slide first? Okay. Up. There should be one between. No? Oh, no, it's okay. Can you go back to the text? Further down. No, as in like it's after the slides that I sorry. No, here. Yeah, it's after the. Good. Thank you. Okay. So that's Ghazni. This is the expansion of the empire of Mahmud of Ghazni. So the Kalachakra Tantra appeared in the world, we think, around 1017. The reason we think that is because there's a date which scholars argue is actually an al-Hijra date. It's an Islamic date, interestingly, which corresponds to roughly 1017. We know it was late, and we know it was translated in 1031, thereabouts. And so the time period is pretty solid for when it appeared. That was a time when particularly it was known that there were these sort of invading forces. There's some really interesting interesting sub conversations to be had here, because particular Buddhist and also Muslim communities that were persecuted were moving through Central Asia in and out, roughly speaking, of Central Asia and India at that time and before that time. So there's this narrative that gives us a narrative of unease. I would also note this is exactly the time when, for example, Atisha went to Tibet. His teacher, Ratnakarshanti, may have gone to Java. There's a lot of movement, and I personally think part of it was people kind of getting out of town, sensing that something was coming. This is my own idea. Okay, could you go to the next? Thank you so much. Okay, so this is the Sanskrit and a translation of Book 1, verse 154. There will be 5 others of darkness in the family of demonic snakes. Moses, Jesus, the white-clad one, Muhammad, and Matani. This is why we think that it's specifically Ismaili and Shia, because these are kind of characteristically Shia names all together, particularly the Matani, who's the Mahdi. The white-clad one is the only kind of one that's debated exactly what that means. Maybe it's Mani from Manichaeism. Maybe it's some tribes were wearing white to distinguish themselves from other tribes. That's personally what I think it was. In any case, the Matani, the 8th, will be blind, Andhika, or he will be in darkness. The 7th Muhammad will be born in the city of Baghdad in the land of Mecca, where the mighty, merciless idol of the barbarians lives in the world. So it's blunt. It did take a little bit of gymnastics for people to figure out that Adro, Anogo, Varahi were Adam, Noah, and Abraham. For example, Abraham, Varahi, the person of the pig, the swineherd, which is an etymology of Abraham's name, apparently. All right? Yeah. Thanks. So while that took some legwork, it's not subtle. Now, what I'll say here, though, some other interesting things. They talk about the Kalachakra Tantra doesn't just talk about Muslims as being sort of evil and destructive, but it does have a narrative that not just Buddhists but all Indic people have to band together against this threat of cultural annihilation, right? And it does adopt apocalyptic narrative. This is my argument, and it's the only example I've ever seen. I believe it is the only example of an apocalyptic narrative in Buddhist tantric literature, at least. But other things that this says, other things that the Kalachakra says about Muslims is that their god is named Ar-Rahman, which is a name of Allah, which means the compassionate one. They may have been attracted to that for some association with Avalokiteshvara. They say that they worship the god through the mantra Bismillah as they sacrifice animals, which Bismillah is what one says when making halal meat, when slaughtering animals for halal meat. The thing that the Kalachakra Tantra narrative likes least about Muslims is the fact that they kill animals. Interestingly, it does say it's okay to eat meat. You just can't eat meat if it didn't die naturally. You can't kill something for meat. That's murder. But last point, I know we got to wrap up. The second book, this is called the Outer Kalachakra Tantra, the first chapter. The second chapter, the Inner Kalachakra Tantra, says, paraphrasing, the war that will be held between the Buddhists and these mlechas, these external forces, is a war that's fought inside oneself. It is not a physical war. So here again, we have this kind of jihad shantideva overlapping of martial imagery. Do they mean it? Do they not mean it? Sure looks like they mean it here, but the second chapter does clearly say this is not a real war. This is a sort of engagement on the Buddhist path. Okay. Thank you, Nor, for doing the slides. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. There's still many questions coming up. Like one of them, why would you think that the translation of Greek texts into
Arabic?
right would actually bring them favor, right, or more
Right.
interest?
Right.
That's
Yeah.
surprising. And
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So many questions still that we could ask about this. I'm really, really thankful and looking forward for the next section.
I hope so.
Either this summer or in the fall. We'll organize another talk on this subject. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And when I have a chance, it'll be, I'd like to focus more, as I said, on Sufism, on tantric practice, on India, basically. I know there's a lot of interest in that. Thanks so much.